Thank you, everyone. And I do want to say while I'm pulling this up, as many of you know, the proposed regulations in all sub-areas do not require the maintenance of the retention of historic windows, and any of the contemporary products would be appropriate. I also want to apologize. My allergies have started today, so it's going to be every year. Well, here we are at the final sort of presentation. As you see before you, we've got a couple things to talk about tonight. We had a great window presentation on sort of what the state-of-the-art options for your home are. I did want to step back a little bit and remind everyone why we're here, and then talk about some of the key revisions that have been made to date. So as a bit of a reminder, we have been working with you for almost a year now, TSW and the City of Atlanta, and have really, I wanted to thank everyone both in the room and not in the room, and all those people who are not participating this evening who have taken surveys and other forms of input. As I've said many times before, this has really been a collaborative effort, and I, as sort of your independent third-party consultant, have really tried to put together something that I think we're going to be very, very proud of, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I also did want to address one thing. During the past week or so, I received a couple of emails from folks about how does this historic district, or how would this historic district relate to other codes. And as you may recall, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the fact that zoning and development and sort of development of property was really regulated by many different things. Obviously, building codes in terms of rating of windows, the tree ordinance, stormwater ordinances, housing codes, health codes, and other city, state, and federal laws. So with that said, nothing in the historic ordinances can supersede any of these things. So when we talk about tree preservation, the tree preservation will apply the same in the historic district as it applies citywide. As we talk about stormwater management, the same regulations apply. And then very significantly, and most poignant to what I wanted to make, as we talk about building codes also will continue to apply in the historic district as they apply citywide. And I wanted to call out that particular point because a lot of you have asked me about the issue of side yard setbacks, and why in the commercial districts we're recommending side yard setbacks of 0 feet and as low as 3 feet in other areas. Again, as I mentioned before, those recommendations came from what the current zoning requires. Most of our commercial districts actually have a 0-foot setback, but they also came from looking at your existing built patterns in your neighborhood. But that doesn't mean that you will probably actually ever see any of those conditions, because setbacks are more of a function of the building code than they actually are of zoning requirements. So for example, on Ponce de Leon Avenue, there has been a 0-foot side yard setback since at least 1982. There has also been that setback requirement in any of the other districts that are commercial or mixed-use zoned in the city. And I can think of 3 or 4 projects in the entire city that have actually ever built to the side lot line. And the reason for that, as you'll see in a moment, is because of building and fire code. As you'll see in a moment, the IBC and the IRC, International Building Code and International Residential Codes, put very stringent fire rating and window opening requirements on any lot line that is not a street lot line. So when property owners develop properties, they're not only looking at the zoning code, they're doing calculations based on the cost of rating a wall, the sort of desirability of units or commercial space that may look out at another building potentially next door, and they're sort of running calculations. And I'd like to use the building across from Ponce City Market on the south side of North Avenue to really show the point that I'm trying to make, which is that the zoning setback has very little meaning. It has very little meaning because in the case of this apartment building, in order to make those units at Amley Ponce Park South, I think it's called, desirable, the property owner voluntarily set back, and there was also a fire lane requirement. So those are probably 20 to 22 feet from the setback. And just for those of you who wondered sort of what the parameters are, I had some of my architecture staff actually pull the building code. And so the building code, again, is very hard to read. But the key things are that if you are any building of any construction type and you are less than 3 feet from a side lot line, you cannot have windows. So even though, for example, we've allowed a proposed 3-foot side yard setback for carriage houses, if that owner wants to have windows and wants to have a really usable space, they have to set back. And there's a very complicated formula that talks about the setback, the type of rating, and the percentage of window openings you have. So I only point that out because a lot of people have expressed a real concern to me that if we change this code, we're suddenly going to get houses built immediately adjacent to the lot line and commercial uses immediately adjacent to the lot line. And I did want to point out that in the case of commercial, this has been allowed for the past 40 years. So, with that said, I wanted to talk about the revisions. You may recall that at our last meeting, we concluded by saying that there were a couple of items that we needed to go back and look at. So we're going to run through those very, very briefly. The first item, as was mentioned, was the sub-area refinement. There has been an updated map, which now shows the property on North Avenue, just east of North Highland in sub-area 3, in this area right here, as we talked about. The other change that we have made relates to how do we handle many things Beltline related. The first thing is, you may recall that the previous language talked about lot compatibility zone in the residential subareas, and it talked about district right-of-way in the commercial subareas. Lot compatibility zone and district right-of-way visibility are basically the same thing. One applies to small buildings, either houses or small stacked flats. The other applies to big buildings like where the Kroger is. And so as part of that, as part of reflecting the fact that the Beltline is a major public space, and I don't think anyone wants to see blank walls along the Beltline or development that doesn't take care of that, we have clarified that the Beltline frontage is considered a district right-of-way. So all of the standards, again, that are in the Beltline overlay, the district now aligns with them in terms of being able to treat that as a front rather than a side of buildings. Additionally, there was a series of clarifications related to where do we apply the lot compatibility zone. One of those was in Type 2 staff review. So as you may remember, Type 2 staff review basically means that you get whatever your project is approved without going before the Urban Design Commission. It is a 14-day maximum wait, but in practice, Doug's team tends to turn it around much more quickly. So the process would be, you apply for a building permit, you get a Type 2 staff review if that's applicable, and then you get your plans stamped and then take it to your building permit. So we wanted to make very clear that that applied to existing alterations within the lot compatibility zone area. So anything not within that would not be subject to that provision. Do you want to clarify this some more? I'm sorry, we've sort of tag teamed on writing this.
Yeah, what Kayla was mentioning is, you might remember in the beginning of the proposal, there's all the types of projects are classified by the kind of review they would need. The more substantial projects, the more involved, the sort of larger, the longer the review process is. So what this is saying is that instead of having visible from the district right-of-way as a standard of when you review an alteration, which is that more ambiguous thing we're trying to eliminate, we applied the compatibility zone, and we'll talk about that definition in just a minute as well, so that it would be very clear what or would not in alteration world would be reviewed by this process. And that wasn't as clear as it could have been, I think, before. So essentially what that means.
Thank you. The other thing that we clarified was, in fact, the default review standards. And Doug, do you want to? I'm sorry. So many of these are above my pay grade, so I'm gonna call on the administrator to talk about the exact purpose itself.
Sure. So again, as I remember, in the first sort of section of the proposed regulations are a lot of the sort of procedural, sort of the sort of framework setting requirements, and one of them was a set of requirements that in this situation were called the default review requirements. The intention of those is to provide a backbone of requirements that would apply to projects that aren't necessarily specifically described in the following, the rest of the code section. So as you might imagine, you can't think of every kind of scenario that might be proposed on a piece of property, particularly as it relates to alterations and additions, that there's a sort of mix and match, because you can really do all sorts of different things we might not be able to dream of. So this set of requirements is added, was included, but we made it clear when it applies, which is when the project is not covered by the other parts of the regulation specifically, as it doesn't relate to your type of building or your type of project, then this would be used to fill in those gaps, if you will. This technique has been, or the set of requirements is in almost all of our district regulations that have been updated in the last 10 or so years. They have that sort of backbone framework as well.
The other change we made relates to clarifying that the Beltline affordable housing inclusionary zoning requirements will continue to apply in the same geographic areas that they apply today. So we've added a small section that actually says that. It just references the Beltline affordability requirements, section 36A of the code, and says that they continue to apply in Posse Hyman. We just wanted to make that absolutely clear, that that existing regulation carries over. Now, there have also been several changes related to, or several questions related to what I call, and this is my technical term, upper story additions. Basically, when you do something above the first floor of a structure that is usually first floor, be it a dormer and a gable addition, or, as we talked about before, adding second story. So I'm going to let Doug explain some of the changes in this particular area as well.
So the idea of providing some definition and parameters to upper story additions, which include 4 different kind of types, is a concept we developed in the Bonsom proposal, and Historic District is currently used in that situation. We had added that to the sort of toolkit, if you will, to the City of Atlanta's situation for historic districts, because that was one of the major questions we got, which is how we could provide some more surety or certainty to those kind of upper story additions. And so the bones of that came from the work we did in Bonaventure, Somerset, and so what we tried to do, we've done a couple revisions along the way we explained before, but the last revisions are what you see here in red. So one is we try to provide some parameter of what a gable or a dormer addition would be, which is occupies only part of the roof plane. And that's in contrast to, you might remember we added a definition about the second story additions, which have vertical walls that at least some of them align with what's underneath them, the house lines. So this is our take on that. As you might, if you're thinking ahead, like I was doing, you'll know that you can add a gable addition to a home that would actually occupy the entire roof plane if you wanted to. So we need to double check that refinement to make sure we don't, unintended consequences, I guess.
Do what now?
Unintended consequences by making a gable addition not clearly fit that definition. But you also know that of course, still in here is the issue of within the compatibility zone, you're having compatibility requirements, and outside, you would not have to have that requirement. That's not changed, I'm just pointing that out. So here's an example that was some photos folks brought together. So the house on the left is the before example of the house, and the house on the right is the after example of the house. So this would be an example of a gable addition, in the sense that they took the current roof structure and, if you will, tipped up that hip to face forward. So you get what's now called you have that sort of double gable effect. You also had a dormer on the side, which would of course be a dormer addition to that building. And if you go to, just keep that in your mind for a little bit. And if you go to the next slide, this was also brought up in some of our commentary, which is folks really concerned about that 10-foot rule of being set back on those kind of additions. Maybe creates very awkward architectural situations, maybe some constructability issues about where you land your walls and so on and so forth. So as was the case on the commercial subareas earlier, we added this idea of some sort of distinct architectural differentiation between the new stuff and the old stuff, or the 10 feet, depending on which one might suit better for your purpose. And so that would allow things that would be something like this, where you would have that gable could go in to be, in this case, essentially at the front wall, which based on our old criteria would not have been permitted, but now this would be an option that folks could consider for those kind of upper story additions.
So, if you go back to that first picture, that is obviously an under roof addition.
Yeah.
So if it were a clear 2-story addition,
Yeah.
how does that apply?
I believe the draft we're working on now, we included this same provision for the true second story addition. as well.
Yeah.
So you can't, as long as it differentiates itself,
Yeah.
you can do something that's
Yeah.
more cohesive.
And this is actually the second story language right here. So we wanted.
So,
Okay.
oh yeah, so that's the second story language. But it would apply to those, the gables
Yes.
too. So then you also notice we did a very small clarification, but I think it's important to understand about rear additions. And this is the one that, if you think of the procedures, is incentivized as having a more quicker process. And we want to make it clear that you're looking at, as far as being underneath the existing height, it's the highest ridge line on the home, not what might not necessarily be right next to the addition. There's a lot of houses in this neighborhood as well as others. I don't know if these are. These really don't give us a
Well, it's a good example.
yeah. But if you have a hip roof house where you have that pyramidal roof, often that'll be pretty tall, but there might have been some sort of even historic extension on the back that would have a lower ridge line because it doesn't need to cover as much footprint. It's all about the geometry, of course. Covering that, the triangle covering that square or whatever it is. So the idea is that you could actually build an addition that might be taller than your immediate roof ridge height, but would still not be taller than the overall tallest one on the property. Now, I'll note just from a experience perspective and constructability, that does present issues if you want to try to attempt to do that, as far as waterproofing and so on and so forth, but it can be done if you want to do that sort of look to the building. We've had people do that in other neighborhoods.
Could you point out in that before and after, the high ridge point in the before?
Yeah, so in this,
Continues into the.
in this example, the highest ridge point, at least what we know on the street, is probably right behind that stovepipe. So this is, probably a full hip roof house. Keep in mind, you have hip roof houses, these are the ones with the pyramid-shaped roofs, where they don't have to meet the point necessarily, they can meet in a really short ridge. So if it's a rectangle, the geometry tells you that you have to have a hip roof that has a ridge on it. If it's a square, you can get that true pyramidal shape. But you don't have to have one single point that it ends at. And in fact, houses that have this little tiny ridge line are actually more common than the ones that have a true pyramid because we don't have very many exactly square houses in the city of Atlanta.
And so that ridge point right there was extended to the front.
Yeah, not how you read this, that's what it looks like. This is what they did, yeah.
So on these smaller footprint bug walls, like 1,500 square foot bug walls, the lower ridge line, the ones where you really can't, they're really low, what can they do?
They can do a second story addition.
So they can a full-on second story addition.
Yeah, and that section hasn't been revised in this scenario, but what we have done is we said you don't have to set it back anymore either. So that was already in the proposal. And this idea of that if you do that, there is still some compatibility requirements which are based on this distance from the front, so that's all starting to sort of gel together if you can sort of bring the different pieces sort of in line together. So this is a second story addition. I think we have actually two examples. Let's just go to this other one right quick. So this is one, and this is the other. The one that's sort of the beige or the red brick would actually be considered, as we turn to find it, a true second story addition. It has vertical walls that in some cases align with the sides of the house. This second one, not knowing exactly what they started with, but this looks like you had an original porch roof gable, and that sort of extrapolated that up in the back. They do have a little bit of vertical wall on the side, which actually turns out relates to their chimney. So this would be sort of a combination addition as well, based on our current definitions. Both of these would generally meet the requirements. I think this first one presents some issues as far as constructability and proportionality, because you have a roof sort of diving into vertical walls in a very awkward circumstance. But if this had come to our office, we probably would have actually talked to them about actually moving some of those walls around to get that awkwardness sort of out of the picture.
Yay.
There's a couple different roof things going on here. It looks like they also tried to retain this little gable in the front. I'm not quite sure where that actually comes from, but in the end, you're actually adding more complications that might even be necessary to make it the addition that would fit in better with the home. So look at that. All right. So then, sort of carrying over this idea of how you would treat some of the buildings in 3, 4, and 5, which are conceptually the mixed-use commercial buildings. We do know there's buildings in those corridors and those subareas that aren't commercial style or form buildings. They're houses, they're a small apartment building, something like that. And so we wanted to have those be treated physically like we treat a house in the house subareas. So they get the idea of having the lot compatibility zone applied to them, just like if they were a house in the house subareas, because they actually are the same type of building. So it makes sense to have them be treated the same.
The next thing that had come up at our last meeting, relatively easy one, was making sure that we don't inadvertently prohibit sort of alternative energy production. And so the draft 2.4 does include language allowing for solar panels and solar energy generating roof materials. And if you see Mr. Musk there, he's actually holding up a Tesla panel, and it's actually installed on the roof on the right. So that is actually a solar panel, energy generating, and we've clarified that that kind of treatment would be permitted in the district.
Real quick, somebody along those lines was asking about those like car charging, electric car charging things. Is that necessary to include anything about that?
That's you mean as permitted?
Yeah.
We did.
We did put it in once.
Yeah, we did. The city does have definitions of those because who has a car charger? Okay, so there's different levels of those chargers, I guess. So you can there are stations now being developed that will be commercial charging stations. And so the city actually has defined different levels of those stations. And so we should check on that only because we don't want to, having removed the regular zoning underneath, we don't want to inadvertently make that an issue.
Yeah.
Because it's already allowed in R5 and R4 for personal use, so to speak.
The personal use ones are just like a drive.
Yeah, I understand.
Drive.
Yeah.
The high energy around charging.
Yeah. There was the discussion around that from our perspective was that at the time, this was a couple of years ago, we tried to suss that out, was that, and they're still thinking that as that market matures, there'll be sort of filling stations for like commercial charging stations. It'll be like sort of like a gas station, but for electricity. We want to try to sort of differentiate those two kinds of circumstances.
I wanted to verify that the solar panels and the solar tiles are available in unhistoric buildings, existing buildings, and not new construction.
Well, this is for alterations or additions, so yeah, it's actually more important for our existing buildings than not.
It's in several parts of the code. That's why it says all sub-area roof materials. So it would apply to all buildings.
And I think because of the way we organize the text and the proposal, we've actually, because this is sort of bureaucratic, these are all considered accessory uses right now, and it says they're not the main use. The main use is the house, and you're adding something to it, like a garage and a generating device. So it's actually an accessory uses part of the proposal. So if you find it there, it's a couple places in there.
But are things like regular solar panels and those that just heat water, which stand up often, permitted or not permitted?
That's just the regular solar panels. The first word.
Yeah, regular solar.
Yeah.
What about windmills?
We do not address windmills. They are considered. They would be governed by the general accessory structure requirements. We have dealt with the windmill situation though.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only one I've known about in my long years of experience so far.
Great. And then the other final change, which is really minor, Doug pointed out, which I knew this, but the sign ordinance changes actually need to go in the sign ordinance, and so they won't actually be included in the district. They'll go into the chapter 28A, which is the sign regulations.
So you're taking it out of the historic?
There will be a section added to 28A that says Ponce Highland Historic District sign requirements.
Okay, so it'll be a separate
Yeah.
section.
Because no actual zoning district has the sign ordinance in it. They're all in that other part of the code.
They've been divided that way for many years.
Keeping the historic signs would fall in that category?
Yes, that was added I think last.
Listen. So that really concludes the changes. And before we take questions, Again, I wanted to take an additional moment to thank everyone for helping us get to the point where we are today. I have known Ponce Highland for at least 30 years. It was one of the first neighborhoods I ever hung out with back in the 90s when I was a young man. And I am, as a planner and an Atlantan, really excited about what this district has accomplished. It has done something that I really think, or could do something that no other historic district in the city has done, which is really to take the district and preserve the critical character-defining features, which in Ponce Highland is the streetscape and the sort of front of the buildings, and at the same time also preserve the rich diversity that the neighborhood has today. And to that end, I am privy to the postcards that went out. Jerry shared them with me, and personally took great offense at some of the accusations in it. I can say in all seriousness and all good faith, this ordinance has received as much, if not more, of my time and my attention and my really careful thought with all of you than any of the other 50 or so codes that I've worked on. It has not been compromised in any way. In fact, I've probably given more of my time than maybe I should have from a purely financial sense, but I think that it is something that you should all be extremely proud of. And really, not only because of sort of the preservation piece from the structural perspective, but also from the perspective of the rich housing diversity that you have in Ponce Highland today. I said this at the first meeting, but a lot of the folks don't understand how the codes today in Atlanta are really pushing communities to monotony and homogeneity. If you look at Virginia Highlands, you will see what happens when R4 zoning does not have any consideration for massing or form. The neighborhood is not the neighborhood that I knew, again, in my youth. It could be wealthy in town Seattle, wealthy in town Chicago. It is not Atlanta anymore. So much of that is lost. The other thing, though, that I'm really extremely proud of as part of this particular ordinance is that Atlanta is rapidly losing what I, as a planner, and many folks call the naturally occurring affordable housing. Any property today that is zoned for multifamily is also zoned for a demolition and construction of $700,000 to $800,000 townhouses. You saw it on Briarcliff Road. You see it all over Virginia Highlands, and you have a lot of properties that are actually zoned that way today. So one of the things that we haven't talked about is the fact that the preservation of the structures, the preservation of the multifamily structures, is highly encouraged in this code. We have made exceptions to the general citywide rules that say if you are a multifamily building in a single-family neighborhood, you cannot renovate or change more than 60% of the value, or you have to tear it down. That will not apply in Ponce Highland. There is a specific provision in this code that says regardless of what you're zoned, you can, in your multifamily, you can renovate the buildings, you can upgrade the buildings, and you don't have to worry about triggering this grandfather provision that forces you to revert back to single family. Additionally, preserving the form is a way of preserving affordability. I know not everyone likes to hear that, but it's a fact. That I think that the fact that we have really come up with what I think is a very good balance between preservation of structure, preservation of housing options, and really preservation of neighborhood character, with the idea to not be a museum. We've written a code that allows people to replace their windows, that allows people to paint brick, that allows people to add second-story additions, that allows multifamily and commercial buildings that are zoned for mixed use to add mid-rise towers in the back along the Beltline. That's really cutting edge and progressive, not only in terms of Atlanta, but in terms of thinking about growth nationwide. And so again, I am extremely grateful to all of you in the room. I'm extremely grateful and thankful to all of you who are watching through Facebook Live. And I'm extremely grateful to everyone who has not been here. And I think you should be proud of yourself, proud of the process, and I hope that this is something that will eventually come to fruition. So with that said, I'm going to get off my soapbox. Thank you very much, and see if you have any more questions for us before we talk about next steps.
Just two questions. One is, somebody added a really nice front porch to their house on Glenwood. Will that be allowed? They had kind of a salt box style house, flat front, added a porch. It was probably one of the last houses in there that doesn't have a front porch, but there's still a few others. Would that be allowed on UDC?
So I think that would be considered a front addition, which is to provide a type 3 for UDC review. And then we don't have too many standards for that. I think it would fall back to the general design criteria we mentioned earlier that are in the front part of the code.
And I want to point out something else, and I'm distancing myself from Doug here because, as you know, Doug is a great administrator of historic ordinances. But the process is set up that anything we've talked about does have a variance process through the board. So I have seen where Doug, sometimes the commission will overrule it for a really compelling case. So I did want to tell everyone that if there is, that there is always that outlet, that there is, as anywhere in the city of Atlanta, you can ask for variances. There are variance opportunities in this code under the usual criteria of size, shape, and topography. And the commission, in my experience, has been very fair at balancing the intent and the purpose when you read the beginning of the ordinances to the fact that you do have current homeowners and current needs in the city. So I wanted to throw that out and just remind everyone of that because we haven't really talked about it. And again, the staff too are really, in my experience as an individual who had to go through this process, they're very easy to work with, and we're not dealing with the historic preservation staff that we would be dealing with in Savannah or Charleston. I mean, they're their own little flavor of Atlanta preservation, and they're very user friendly.
And one more. I'm sorry, everybody. I've never heard anybody talk about the houses that are along Glenwood and Bonavent for the backs of the houses that overlook the park and overlook Freedom Parkway. Nobody's ever, I've never heard nobody say, well, you can see all the backs of those houses from Freedom Parkway. Are they gonna have the same freedom to do?
Yes.
So if you look at the definitions in the code, which this actually hasn't changed in the proposal in some time, it defines district right-of-way as public streets in the city, in the proposed area, but excludes Freedom Parkway. Because that actually came up in the bond sum conversation as well, because all those properties on Bonavent are backs up.
Right here. All public streets except Freedom Parkway, but including the amendment line. And so lot compatibility zone, again, not to get technical, is always based on the front. The city of Atlanta defines the front as both the original orientation of the lot and the public street that it's on. So Freedom Parkway is absolutely a back under the city code. Yes, sir?
So question, guys. I'm looking at the multifamily spreadsheet that was handed out. So I haven't seen the new code, but it looks like there's some pretty significant changes. I'm looking at that you have to have certificates of appropriateness for painting and for repairing siding, repairing roof, repairing windows. Is that correct?
You would, because that has not changed from the very beginning. In a multifamily building, one, you need to get a building permit for all of that today. You can still do it in the future.
Correct.
And we've always required window replacements to get type 2 staff review, and that's what we would ask for in a multifamily building. That's not new. The chart's new, but that concept was new.
I thought the expectation was always that repairs would not require a certificate of appropriateness.
Repairs that are ordinary repair and maintenance, which have a threshold of $2,500 or less. That's always been the case as well.
So if it's going to be more than $2,500, you got to get a certificate of occupancy or a certificate of appropriateness no matter what.
If it's not ordinary repair and maintenance, yes.
What about the painting?
So the value of what you need a building permit is based on the $2,500 or not. So if you needed a building permit for your work, then you'd also be asked to come see the staff for a certificate of appropriateness. If you don't need a building permit, then you don't get to see the value.
How long does it usually take to get a certificate of appropriateness for painting if it's over $2,500, for example?
As Caleb said, we're processing those in a couple days or less. But I think the key factor on a multifamily building is the question of we need a building permit or not for that work, which is based on the value of the work.
I just want to be clear. Ordinary repairs and maintenance that rise above $2,600,
$2,500.
$2,500 do require a certificate of appropriateness. Is that correct?
That's right.
They do today.
And if they don't today,
They would
a
need a building.
certificate of appropriateness?
Not
Absolutely not.
You have to get a building permit.
That's a very different thing.
And how much does that certificate cost? Is that a $10
It's
one?
$10.
And then the other thing is that painting will require a certificate of appropriateness if it's going to cost more than $2,600.
So if you look at which has not changed from the beginning, so I believe you have your code section in front of you. So if you look at the type 1 exemptions, there's a specific exemption for painting work.
Painting and repainting of any structure or portion thereof does not require a certificate of appropriateness.
Yes. So we need to make sure the chart that we gave you as a summary is correct, but I would refer you to the code, which is what would rule.
I mean, what's correct?
The code is correct.
The ordinance.
The ordinance is correct. I apologize for not making the chart exactly specific in the terms that you asked. But the code is what we'd be obviously administering.
So the code that I have, which is the prior version, is correct regarding painting. When are we going to get the new version?
Jared, have you shared the new version that we sent out before? Or is it on the website?
We haven't shared the newest version.
Okay.
You're saying the one that we published last was a version that's been passed around recently between us.
Okay, yeah.
But that version's not been published yet.
Yeah, well, by all means, should share it. And it's the 2.4 that we've talked about with only the changes that we've noted. There's like 8 changes from the previous version, which was 2.2. The reason there's a 2.2 to 2.4 is because I made changes, I gave it to Doug, Doug gave them back to me, I found some typos and created a new 2.4. So there's not actually a full third version, it's just I'm a stickler for not having multiple people work on the same file, so it goes from 2.2 to 2.4.
All right, I've got a serious question. In the version that I have, that was put out the last one, section 16-20V.005, C, says that type 3 certificates of appropriateness are required from the Urban Design Commission for all additions or alterations to multifamily buildings. Is that correct? That cannot be correct.
Alterations. Okay, section I've got there.
Additions and alteration,
Okay.
except for ordinary repair and maintenance.
That's right.
Yeah, that's what it says.
So if I need to get a door, I need a type 3 certificate of appropriateness.
No, because if you know doors are considered repair and maintenance.
If I'm replacing a door,
As long as you're not changing the opening. You actually don't need a building permit for that.
what if I'm replacing a window?
So windows are a little different in the building code because actually you do need a building permit for that. And I believe those are covered as staff reviews as they would be for other things. So it's the certificate levels are, when it's not including the type 2 staff reviews, what's including type 3. So they're not layered, they're moving up exclusively to each other. So we can make that clearer if that's helpful to your situation.
Right now, what I've got is that it's a type 3 certificate of appropriateness. And unlike in the other provisions that say that the type 2 in this historic district are going to be staff review, very, very easy, intended to be very, very quick, you have to go back to the regular part of chapter 20. So what we're looking at there is a public hearing, a $100 application fee. That's the way it's written right now.
Yeah, I can answer that. he deals with the process.
Just to ask a question, if you're talking about a property, do you have or plan to represent that's in zones 3, 4, or 5?
Correct. My name is David Metzger. I'm an attorney. I'm not a resident. But I do represent the owner of multifamily homes in subsection 1 and 3. I want to point out too that, I mean, multifamily, that would include condominiums.
Yeah.
And as this is written, this would apply to new construction as well.
Like a new multifamily building?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, all new construction is covered in some ways, yeah. Which is pretty common in historic districts.
I just feel like nobody's gonna wanna build a multifamily building if they have to get a public hearing to replace a window in a new building.
We look at Inman Park, it's a historic district, and they built the most popular area in the whole city right now. So it is a historic district. We wouldn't be building.
I don't know
I
what their
strongly
code
disagree
says.
with that.
I don't know what their code says. All I'm going is by what we have here.
I will say, having lived in Inman Park, there is way stricter limits.
I believe it. I know they built a lot there. What I see here is not good for multifamily.
Okay. We'll take a
I
look at it.
thought what you said if we're building a new building, we had to get a certificate of,
Right now, if somebody's
to
considering,
replace a window,
correct.
but that's not a new construction.
Right now, if somebody's considering building a multifamily building in what would be under this historic district, they have to look at what their maintenance expenses would be once they start operating.
Oh,
And even though they're not a historic building, they would be subject to this. And right now, as it is written, it says that any alteration to a multifamily building, whether it's historic or not historic, has to follow these provisions, which include getting a type 3 certificate of appropriateness for something like replacing a window. That's not right.
I'll make a comment to that. So I work for a national real estate investment firm.
Right. Yes.
You know that, we can
Yeah.
So, invest in apartments, office, retail, industrial, this does not bother me in the slightest.
Okay.
That's what,
This would just be part of the operating budget. It's just as simple as getting a permit. It's not overly burdensome as an investor to not.
I just,
How much fun these can be.
Then is that something we could clarify? That-
Sure.
That replacing a window
Yeah.
would be a type 2
Yep.
certificate
Yeah.
for a multifamily building? Just-
yeah, actually
The
just thought of that.
intent isn't to make it burdensome, it's something that,
Yeah, I think I just was thinking about it as a potential language change to make it so that it's more of a clear it's a SEER step. So if you're not covered by a lower provision, which would be the staff review, then you go into the commission hearing situation. But right now, it does sort of look like there's an overlap, so we can take care of that. Thanks for pointing that out.
sorry. Sounds like it has.
Yeah, no,
It's-
yeah,
I don't want to involve.
yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
Any,
Appreciate it.
Any other questions or?
I'll ask it. Are there any restrictions, these are questions to you, so are there any
Yeah.
restrictions on antennas in backyards, like 30-foot ham radio antennas, for example?
So a standalone 30-foot radio antenna would be an accessory structure, so we have to meet whatever those distance and placement requirements are, which is the case today, actually.
Another question was about, is there a minimum of 30-foot for building on the outside of Monteleone? Is that?
It's not worded as 30 feet, it's worded as two stories. Yep.
And can you comment on if that's in keeping with the current construction on there, on the overall? Is it
Like
higher
the current
than-
buildings? Yeah, there's several buildings. If you had a two-story residential building, you're probably looking at slightly less than a 30-foot height. The floor-to-floors are usually less. There's obviously a lot of one-story buildings which are fully not 30 feet. Just trying to go down the street here. You do have a couple two-story buildings that with their roof would be 30 feet because we measure actual height now instead of the statistical height, kind of thing. then of course, like the turn off detail, obviously, we have the 30 feet. So, in a mixed-use setting, you're gonna get, your buildings have, where no one would do this, but if you did, you'd have one commercial floor and one residential floor, and that'd be about 30 feet, total, but no one's gonna build that because of the economics of it all, so. Yeah. But that would be, give or take a two-story building, depending on what you put in it.
Someone has a question regarding historic signage, and asking will it still be covered to preserve, is the way they think.
Yeah, so we don't have a slide on it, but if in the most recent draft, like they have to move the sign provisions, just or literally at the end of the document, they actually will show up in the proposed ordinance, if and when we do that, as two sets of changes. One will be to the regular zoning code, one will be the sign ordinance, but yes, there's a provision of two historic signs. And those are the same classification of what's considered historic, just as if the building were itself.
We have one other one about, like, there's a guy working on his car on the street, he comments on if we can make that illegal.
Not in zoning. Not in zoning.
Nice try. Yeah,
Any-
it's a common issue.
I have a question. I live in a non-conforming lot like most people here do. I'm pretty much at my lot coverage capacity and have the setback issues. And I met with an architect to discuss putting a garage in the back corner. And he told me under the current zoning, it could take about 4 months to get a variance. Does that sound about right?
For current, probably 2, but were you at the last meeting? So what we've done, 3 meetings ago, we had a lot of people very concerned about non-conforming lots, because actually most of your lots don't conform to R4. So what we did was we created a sliding scale. So for every 500 feet you are below the requirement, in R4 I think it's 9,000, your lot coverage actually goes up by 2%.
That's under the proposed regulation.
Yes, under the proposed.
Currently, I'd have to go.
Yeah, right now, you would have to,
It's either 50 or 55%.
So I'd have to get 2 variances for the setback, for the lot coverage, and I'd have to go through land use, the board,
Yeah.
neighborhood, the MPU, and then the CRP.
yes, no, BZA.
BZA, Board of Zoning Adjustment, but same.
And
Yeah.
approximately how long is that?
It's still I'd say more it's a 3-month process.
I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
2 to 3.
So,
Can they say no in step in the process?
which the,
Like, can I get through like the board, the neighborhood, the MPU, and then get told no
Yes.
2 months down the road?
yeah.
By BZA can rule against, everything else is a recommendation. BZA can rule against it, but really as a matter of course, they don't do that very often.
So in the new proposed regulation, I'd go to your office and get my answer in like a couple of weeks.
So we have twice monthly meetings, so the 3-week cycle. And the other thing that we do, which is not unique to this district, we've done it for a long time, is that if there's a design review needed, let's say you had a second-story addition or something that required that public hearing, we would do the variance analysis at the same time as the design review analysis, so you actually get the answer to that and have a discussion at the same time, at the same cycle of meetings.
But you may not need the variance because
So that's true too.
of the sliding scale. And the other thing we've done is we have tied the definition of lot coverage to the definition used for stormwater. So right now, gravel driveways count towards lot coverage. Under the proposed ordinance, if it's a pervious paving or grass-free, they do not count.
Wait a second, say that again?
As drafted, we have incorporated the Bonsam language, which says that pervious paving materials do not count towards lot coverage.
You're allowed that?
That was in, when I went for mine, I changed all the concrete to gravel.
Yeah.
To make it.
But was that stormwater or was that zoning?
It was stormwater.
Yeah, so we've aligned the two.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay.
Yeah.
Because again, City of Atlanta has 2 different definitions of lot coverage, stormwater and zoning. We have made the stormwater definition the same definition in zoning for this district because it's very confusing for people.
It's a good thing to, it needs to get more lot coverage.
Oh, I know.
So one of the things I'll say about this is actually really useful to us as the folks who administer the codes, because when you think about explaining to a regular person who's coming in for an application, they're like, well, I'm actually not doing impervious surface here, I'm doing gravel or whatever it is. And you're like, well, no, it still counts against your lot coverage. So in situations with those pervious paving materials, are like particularly on the grass street in Quixo we're talking about, this has like holes in the paver, and so like there's actually grass growing between solid stuff. Those products normally come with a permeability factor. So like, if you put down a 10 by 10 square grass street, 50% of it's grass, 50% is still the actual stuff. And so you get that benefit sort of worked back into the calculation.
Proportional.
Yeah.
No?
How does it work for a developer who wants to do a big thing on ponds? Like, what does it look like for that person now and then under this?
Yeah, so right now along Ponce in particular, there's a couple different zoning categories that are going on. There's a couple of residentially zoned only properties. There's a couple that are zoned both residential and commercial together, and there's a couple that are zoned just commercial. So what this does, among other things, is provides the standards are the same across Ponce. It also, just architecturally speaking, requires folks to have build up to the street, so you get sort of more urban pedestrian, that reinforcing what would have been the historic character of that street in the past. It precludes parking from going in front, which is in some cases still allowed today. It will require articulation of the building, so have doors and windows on the ground floor, which isn't necessarily required today either. I'm trying to think of some. It had a minimum building height, so you actually start to get some substance on Ponce as far as, again, that historic character that exists in a few places on Ponce, but not all the places. It also deals, as Lisa was pointing out, building typology. So we have 2 or 3 building typologies that are proposed to be on that corridor, which would give you the, even if they're residential side, would give you a commercial form to that corridor, which wouldn't be required today necessarily either.
So just from a process, I want to know how it works. If somebody says, I want to build my Chase Bank, they just build it, they just know the code and go forward? Like, do you guys then look at it and say, yep, that follows the historic district guideline? I don't know what that process is.
Sure. So the way someone in the city reviews any zoning proposal to figure out if it meets the requirements that apply. So in a historic district, the zoning and design analysis falls to the historic preservation staff, which is the group that I manage, or the urban design commission, which you've heard tonight, which is the public hearing board that does that. So in either case, you're getting some analysis to make sure it fits whatever the requirements end up being for that particular piece of property. And that's all a pre-permitting process. So you're getting all that sort of squared away, if you will, the design requirements versus the sort of building code requirements. Some people call it the entitlement process. And so you get that design stuff all figured out, and then that sort of becomes your design package you then take for the rest of the building permit package like we would for any other project in the city of Atlanta.
Now, if you, I mentioned before, Urban Design Commission has public hearings, and so there are quite a few neighborhoods which actually create an advisory neighborhood group that voluntarily meets with applicants in advance and then goes and speaks on behalf, often in support, to the commission on the particular application.
Sometimes not.
Sometimes not, sometimes in support, often in support if they're conforming.
So that's a good point in sort of neighborhood practice, that, for newbies to having this historic district, how we manage our internal board structure, that's something good to know.
Yeah.
It definitely, if the district were created, is a good way to create a partnership between the folks who are personally in the neighborhood, commercial, residential, otherwise, and the city staff who are administering it on their behalf. And we really, as I said, maybe not here, I say it a lot of other places, we have public hearings for the public. That's why we have them versus for the staff, because we also already looked at the application ourselves and have our opinion about the situation. And it's also a good opportunity for folks to be in a neutral setting, where they're given equal time to do their commentary and presentations and ask questions, because that's, of course, how you run an equitable process if you're in that public hearing mode.
I had a quick question just about the gentleman's concern over here. As I'm reading the summary of this, basically literally the only two things that require a type 3 certificate are second story additions of new buildings. Is that what we're trying to clarify, or is that, I guess I didn't quite understand this concern.
Well, I think that,
It seems that's incorrect, based on what.
I think what David was referring to is that the code sections don't differentiate really between the different types, and so we need to make sure that's the case. So there's not a additional burden placed on non-single-family homeowners, commercial, mixed-use, residential, or multifamily.
So, but the intention is this, and the idea is that the code just needs to be clarified to
I
reflect.
think that's a good way to describe it.
Okay.
And I've just telling Caleb about potential solution to that already. The one thing I would add, we did not put on any of the summary charts is, which we've already referred to as the variance question. Does also go to public hearing, which is consistent across the board in other districts. But we're just trying to focus on the physical changes that you might be curious about. Yeah, that's why we appreciate folks who are looking at it maybe with a fresh pair of eyes to look at both the summary charts and the code, because we've been working on it for a while. And we don't want to miss anything that's important to folks.
Thank you.
On that note, so where are we now? We would like to get any sort of any additional feedback from you. Do we have comment cards tonight? If you do have any other questions or comments, please fill out the comment cards. Doug and I will be coordinating to make these changes, these sort of clarification and correction changes as quickly as possible, because we know that COVID-19 willing or not, that you're going to be having some sort of, we'll be back again in about 6 days to have a final vote on this, and we'd like to get you a revised version as quickly as possible.
Yeah, given that we're voting in 6 days, I mean, can we get some kind of time frame on when the newest version of the code can be online?
Well, I didn't do the last time, sorry.
Given that we're voting in 6 days, can we get some idea of the timetable of when this latest version is going to be available online?
It's all online by tomorrow morning.
Okay.
with
He'll have the 2.4.
presentation and everything.
2.4.
Which is what to talk about.
We need to make this one change to address the gentleman's.
Can we commit to trying to get the updated one by Tuesday? Or
It's literally going to take like 5 minutes. It's just fun. I mean,
So Monday.
I'm going to pull it to you.
I wanted to kind of so Monday at the latest, we'll have the final, quote unquote final version for everybody.
I think we can do that, yeah.
Okay.
We'll post it immediately, post it, notify everyone.
Great.
This is more a question for Jerry. I mentioned this when you were a little bit on the way up. If we can very soon get to a clear way of the vote, if people are worried about the virus, how they can worry about it less, just a way that we'll go through the process in a quick way. There are some people who will be concerned and may not let the ballot vote. There's another group of people who are concerned about not doing an absentee ballot. So if there's just clarifying that to the community as soon as possible.
Sure. So we'll do that in the context of it. The absentee ballot is an option for everyone that doesn't want to come. It's an option. If you choose to go that route, you get a confirmation back, an email back that says, we've received your information, everything's in good order, your ballot's been passed. So you can do that, and you'll know for sure that your vote was there. But you're saying, the second thing was saying, is there a way that I can just come here immediately, just come and leave, and I'm sure we'll implement that, a lot of people do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
so, I can say, you have to use some if you're not covered above, then so like, which now, I'm going to check the language and then make sure that it's where you want it to be, which is exactly what you're talking about.
Well, it's still 50%. Well, that was actually the time. We asked them to very well. Yeah, that's. Oh, it's not.
Yes, it's,